we're beginning to see a number of really successful Chinese companies, particularly in the internet space, that are racing ahead of the rest of the world. And I think this is causing tremendous unease and anxiety in Washington.
If you had to name the biggest breakup in recent history, which would it be? Sonny and Cher? Brangelina? Bill and Hillary? Well, they're sort of still together. Hello and welcome to the GZERO World podcast, where you'll find extended versions of the interviews from my show on public television. And today on the podcast, I'll examine why the decoupling I'm talking about is not only far bigger than any star-studded tryst, it's also the product of a long-distance relationship gone wrong. Don't they always? He's in Washington, she's in Beijing. And over time, it just became clear they wanted different things. To help me lay out the stakes is a woman who says there's no going back. I speak with Sam Sachs, cybersecurity and China digital economy fellow at the New America Foundation. Let's get to it.
The GZERO World podcast is brought to you by our founding sponsor, First Republic. First Republic, a private bank and wealth management company, places clients' needs first by providing responsive, relevant, and customized solutions. Visit firstrepublic.com to learn more.
Sam Sachs, cybersecurity policy fellow at New America. Good to be with you.
Great to be back here, Ian.
So talk to me about the great decoupling. This is something that's not new in the sense, the term is become en vogue recently, but you say that to understand it, we have to look back at the last decade to show how these two largest economies in the world have been moving towards this moment.
Right. Go back to the early 2000s. You have the Chinese government putting in place plans to double down on reducing reliance on foreign suppliers, build up domestic industries in these technology sectors. This is what's called industrial policy. It's sort of state blueprints to funnel support to move the economy away from low value-add manufacturing sectors to high tech. This is value-added sources of growth to drive the economy.
Something pretty much every industrial economy wants to do.
Sure. Mm-hmm. And it's been an abysmal failure for years. China's talked about next generation information technology, IT, about aerospace, all of the list of sectors. And they haven't been able to do it. But in the last few years, we're beginning to see a number of really successful Chinese companies, particularly in the internet space, that are racing ahead of the rest of the world. And I think this is causing tremendous unease and anxiety in Washington.
What is it about what China's up to that makes us believe that only now can they truly compete with the United States in the highest of technology spaces?
So your friend Kai-Fu Lee, the author of AI Superpower, had a great analysis about this. He talked about a number of factors. One is you have this generation of Chinese entrepreneurs who are working round the clock, driven by this cutthroat culture where, we think about IP theft against multinational companies. Well, IP theft is rampant in China. And as Kai-Fu says, this keeps entrepreneurs on their toes. They have to outcompete in this cutthroat environment. You have Chinese internet users who are hungry for new applications, using mobile phones. They basically skipped over credit cards, went from a cash society to this e-payment society.
And nobody carries credit cards in China.
Nobody cares. I've gone to China and lost my ATM card in a machine and just paid for everything on my phone. Doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. And then at the same time, you have the Chinese government saying, we want China to be what's called a cyberspace superpower, a technology superpower. And you've seen a tremendous amount of state resources funneled into fields like artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, next generation mobile communications, and companies investing a ton of R&D in really racing ahead.
Now, when we talk about the two decoupling, not just competing, but decoupling, that implies that the Chinese are going to have their companies, their products, their Internet of Things. We're going to have ours. Is that what we're talking about?
That's a piece of it. So one element would be if you are a multinational company, you serve markets around the world. When you show up at an airport, say, and you open up your phone and you want to be able to get text messages, you want to be able to use your credit card when you show up around the world, it's this understanding that the systems are interoperable. You can use them seamlessly. So if we move down this path of separate systems, it's possible that you might have products and services that simply don't work in markets around the world. And what does that do? I mean, it does a number of things. It drags on costs. So the margins for multinational companies, they have to build products and services to comply with all these different standards is one. I think you also have a delay in innovation, right? The idea that researchers and engineers are working on apps, on applications that are built on common infrastructure, this sort of open source common infrastructure, and that's what's really driving advancement. And as soon as you start to pull that apart, you see a lag time in terms of being able to really move forward.
So we understand why that would be problematic for the companies who historically have wanted to have access to every market and every scientist and every advance. How is it going to affect the experience of a typical consumer, either in the United States or in China? What will they feel that's different?
Well, things might get more expensive, but I think there's also a component of safety, right? I think about these are technologies that are going to fundamentally alter human society. And we don't have rules of the road yet when it comes to safety and ethics for how these technologies are going to be deployed. And I think if you have the best companies, the best researchers around the world not able to talk to each other and communicate about that, that becomes actually kind of dangerous. So that's, it doesn't mean you show up at Walmart or Best Buy and have trouble finding the right product. It's more of an existential thing. What is it going to mean when computers are woven seamlessly through our lives and we don't have rules of the road? We don't have the best minds around the world talking to each other about how to do that. That's where I worry about my children.
Well, we also, right now, one of the interesting things, time zones, of course, are different, and different people are awake at different times, so Americans and Europeans don't necessarily talk seamlessly. But there's a period of time, if you're on Twitter, if you're on Facebook, there's a period of time where, you're actually getting news from those people, their photographs from those people, you're sharing with them if you want to follow them. Is that going to not happen between, say, Americans and Chinese in 5 and 10 years' time, in your view?
Let's distinguish between the underlying internet infrastructure and the applications that run on top of it. I think when it comes to the applications, yes, we're going to start seeing, for example, some users are going to be using the Chinese ride-sharing service Didi. Some are going to be using Uber. Some
American users will use Didi.
Potentially. If they're in parts of, probably not here, but maybe in, they go travel in Southeast Asia, for example, or in emerging economies. They might opt for that Chinese service. But I don't see the underlying internet infrastructure, the basic things that allow you to send an email or to be able to, use the Chinese users use virtual service providers, VPNs, in order to break outside of the great firewall that censors content. I don't necessarily see that type of infrastructure going away. If we got into a time where, say, the domain name system of the internet, the thing that when you type in the email, the internet address that then gets you to the website, when you're in China, when you're in other parts of the world, that still works. So if we got into a situation where the actual underlying infrastructure of the internet was different around the world, that's where you get into a true fragmented, so-called splintered internet. Right now, I'm thinking more about the applications that run on top of it. And that's where I think you're going to start to see more Chinese alternatives to the things that an American consumer might typically think of.
So the fight between the United States and, say, Huawei, which is going on right now, in your view, that's not about the underlying architecture. That's about what sort of applications are going to be experienced by Americans and Europeans, that the 5G systems between the two will still be interoperable.
In the United States, we're not going to see Chinese telecom companies supplying the core infrastructure. No way. And they're not already, except you have some rural areas where there is no alternative to Huawei.
And Huawei's cheap, yeah.
And it's cheap, it works. But we're already phasing that out because of what things the Trump administration is doing.
So do you think that between the United States and China, world's two largest economies. Is this decoupling now past the point of no return? Is it inevitable?
I think it's become a self-fulfilling prophecy. It didn't have to be inevitable, but now at this point, the rhetoric on both sides is dialed up. I think nationalism in China, techno-nationalism, this idea that technology is a tool of the state, is more deeply ingrained now than it was, say, 2 years ago. There's no going back. It's just a question of, where are we going to draw the lines from here? What's the degree that we will decouple? Will there still be areas of overlap? How far and how fast is this going to go?
Now, for the last 30, 40 years, as Americans looking at China, with interlinkages between our two economies, you may not be rooting for the Chinese, but you know that if the Chinese grow, you're going to benefit from that economically as well. As we talk about the inevitability of this decoupling, does that mean that we as Americans are going to be rooting for the Chinese system, its technological system, to fail?
There are certainly some people here that are. And this is where we get into the politics internal to this push from the Trump administration, right? I think there are some, like the Steve Bannons of the world, the Navarros of the world, that would like China to fail. What's their end game? I would say it's regime change. I say they want Xi Jinping out. And as Bannon said recently at a meeting that I was at with him, it's not going to be pretty, but we'll figure it out.
But take a step back from there. I'm saying leave aside regime change. Let's talk just about the fact that if we have two competing systems, they're not interlinked anymore between the US and China, and you think that that train has left the station. So the average American, should we be rooting for the American system to defeat, in a sense, the Chinese technological system?
No, I mean, this is really dangerous. We should be rooting for the U.S. to maintain its leadership, its competitive edge. But does that mean rooting for the Chinese system to fail? That's what I'm saying no to.
The Chinese technological system.
The Chinese technological system
We should
to fail.
not.
No, healthy competition is good for everybody, right? If we're playing defense and we're just trying to win based on fear, I think that hurts us.
Despite the fact that there is now this big phase one trade deal between the United States and China, and so in principle, Trump is saying Xi Jinping got the deal done. Why are we not more sanguine about the trajectory of the relations between these two countries?
The phase one trade deal, whatever it is kind of like a Band-Aid. It doesn't address what I think are going to be deeper areas of conflict focused on technology, that no matter what happens with this phase one, this phase two deal, are going to continue to bubble up. The CFO of Huawei, Meng Wanzhou, is sitting under house arrest in Canada. Her extradition hearing is set to begin in January. What the heck is going to happen with her? If she is extradited to the US, it is massively escalatory from Beijing's perspective. But if she is released, the China hawks in Washington are going to be livid and there's going to be backlash. So she's a ticking time bomb.
Let's explain what exactly the claim is that she has done. Why is she presently sitting under house arrest?
So we've been talking about cybersecurity issues and technologies. The reason she's under house arrest actually has very little to do with that. She's under house arrest because of violating sanctions relating to Iran. There's a whole litany of complaints that the US government has with Huawei. And so sanctions with Iran is one of them, and that's what's landed her in her current predicament.
And from that perspective, I mean, I'm not saying you're a lawyer, but is that a reasonable, in your view, reason to have her brought to the United States under charges?
I don't think so, personally.
Because?
Well, you know, it's not unprecedented to press charges against someone for these kinds of offenses, right? And I'm not in a position to evaluate that. I think what would have happened in a different administration is the calculation about when to arrest her. The circumstances around that would have been made in a broader context about what the ramifications of that would be. And I'm just saying that the context in which she was put under house arrest, it happened specifically to get leverage over the Chinese government as part of a trade deal.
Because we don't see a lot of Democrats or Republicans in Congress right now saying we should let this woman go.
No. No.
It's one of the very few issues that you seem to see bipartisan agreement on, is taking a harder line on national security issues with China.
Totally.
Now, I mean, the interesting thing is President Trump himself on human rights issues, right, on, say, Hong Kong, on Xinjiang, someone you don't see a lot of toughness from.
So this is what's baffled me for months. There have been reports coming out that over 1 million Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities are under detention in Xinjiang. Mass incarceration, right? Using technology like AI, like big data, like tracking apps, specifically to do so. We've known this for months. Vice President Pence multiple times was supposed to give a speech at the Hudson Institute in Washington criticizing China for this and other human rights abuses, and he kept canceling the speech because trade talks, this was seen as derailing trade talks. They finally did it. They came out and they put a number of Chinese companies on the entity list, specifically designed to punish them for enabling detention in Xinjiang.
These were companies that were providing the tools to allow surveillance, and you can't do business with them anymore.
Exactly. These are like facial recognition, AI companies. And so the Trump administration came out and said, we are the first administration to take China to task on Xinjiang and other issues like this. It's true, and I applaud them for taking action. But the timing is weird because they did it at a key moment as trade talks were going on, which either meant, one, they were trying to use it as leverage in a trade deal. Now, why would you use human rights as leverage in a trade deal? Although I'm positive that's not the first time that's been done, right? The other school of thought is that the decouplers, the real hawks in the administration,
wanted the deal to die.
Wanted the deal to die.
And that's why they pushed it.
Yeah.
But it didn't work.
Didn't work.
Didn't work because Trump wants a deal.
Right.
But the decouplers still have influence.
Huge influence.
So that's where we seem to be going. Okay, now if you're not the United States and China, let's imagine you're in another country and you're watching all of this go on. You're sitting there in Europe. You're sitting there in Asia. You may be an ally of the United States, but China is increasingly your dominant trade partner. How do you respond to pressure from both the United States and from China that, no, you listen to me?
So let's look at Germany for a moment. They came out recently, earlier this fall, and they said, we're not going to ban Huawei from our 5G supply network. We're going to evaluate everybody the same, which means we're not going to target a company because it's Chinese. We're going to evaluate all the vendors based on the same technical cybersecurity criteria. And I was in Europe at the time, and one of the sort of rumors that was percolating was Merkel is still furious about the fact that the US government was listening in on her phone calls, as was revealed in the Snowden revelations. And this is sort of saying, look, you have Chinese surveillance, you have US surveillance. Given the tight economic interdependence with China that Germany has, why would we shoot ourselves in the foot? But I think Germany is still in play, right? I think there's still a lot of internal back and forth.
If Germany is seen to be trying to be more open to the Chinese, why would the Chinese foreign ministry be threatening the Germans and say that if you take our 5G out, if you go after Huawei, which is not a Chinese state company, then we are going to say that your cars are unsafe?
Germany's being threatened by both sides. So
I understand that.
And then the Trump administration has threatened to cut off intelligence sharing with Germany. Germany's in a really tough spot.
So what are they, but you're saying,
where are they going to land in all of this?
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah, but so you're saying that the Chinese, despite the German perspective, the Chinese are not saying, they're not buying this idea that the Germans are being even-handed.
Well, it's unclear yet what they're going to do in the end. So in that measure where they came out and said, we're going to evaluate everyone the same, they also put language in there that would give them a cover if they wanted to ban Huawei. Here's what they said. They said, as part of evaluating these vendors, we're also going to look at the political system of the country that those companies come from and see if that vendor, meaning Huawei, might be subject to undue political influence. So what that does is in one document, it kind of leaves them room to go either way.
Right. So the Germans haven't made a decision yet.
Right.
They're under pressure from everyone.
Yeah.
And I mean, there are a lot of other countries. Let's face it, if that's Germany, that's a big economy with more influence and with the focus on national security and rule of law. You have to think that there are that weaker European economies that need the money more are going to be tilting more towards Beijing. Am I wrong about
Totally.
that? That is what they're doing.
I think we're going to see a spectrum of responses. I think you're going to have some which are going to do the UK approach. So what the UK has done is they've had Huawei in the network for like 15 years. And they have a system where they keep Huawei equipment out of what's called the core, the critical part of the network. But they allow it, say, in the part of the network that if there were a problem, maybe you couldn't watch your sports channel on TV. And then they have a center that evaluates everything that comes on. It's called the Huawei Cybersecurity Evaluation Center. So the idea is monitor everything that comes on the network, keep it out of the really critical stuff. And so some countries are probably going to take that kind of middle approach. Other countries are probably going to just ignore the risk altogether.
Is this one where if you can't get a little bit pregnant, once you're actually working with Huawei, you're working with Huawei? Once they're in your system, they're in your system. What do you think?
This gets into a pretty technical debate, which is in an era of 5G, where you're going to have more and more devices connected to the internet. Is it even?
It's everything.
It's everything.
It's your clothing. It's your refrigerator. It's not just your smartphone.
It's not just, so the idea that you can distinguish between the critical core and a device that's connected on the edge that you would think of as just your clothing, just a device. The idea is in this 5G computer era, will you even be able to draw that distinction? And I've heard technical experts argue both sides. So here's what I think this all comes down to. I think that if you see Huawei as a risk, it's kind of like a Rorschach test. And the Rorschach test being, how do you see the Chinese government? If you see the Chinese Communist Party as a threat, then you're gonna see Huawei, no matter where it is in your network, as a problem.
Sam Sachs, good to be with you.
Thanks.
That's it for the podcast this week. We'll be back in your feed next week. Check out full episodes of GZERO World on public television or at gzeromedia.com.
The GZERO World podcast is brought to you by our founding sponsor, First Republic. First Republic, a private bank and wealth management company, places clients' needs first by providing responsive, relevant, and customized solutions. Visit firstrepublic.com to learn more.
You're listening to the GZERO World with Ian Bremmer podcast, your weekly geopolitical deep dive into the world's biggest news stories, featuring in-depth conversations with global leaders and newsmakers. To get more of GZERO's insights on global politics every morning, sign up for our free newsletter, GZERO Daily, at gzeromedia.com.